He slid an $11,000 check across the polished mahogany table like he was paying off a minor stain. That was 3 weeks of severance for 21 years of service. "Evelyn," Preston Vance said, tapping the edge of the paper with one manicured finger. "Sign the resignation papers now or leave with zero. We are moving in a fresh direction. 3 weeks. That was the price they put on me at 17 minutes past 4 on a Friday. With human resources sitting there in silence and the chief financial officer pretending this was a clean business decision instead of a cheap corporate execution. I did not reach for the check. I just looked at it, then at Preston's Apple Watch, then at Diana Holt from Human Resources, who kept her eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table like eye contact might make her morally responsible. Julian Mercer, our chief financial officer, cleared his throat. "Legacy roles are expensive. Frankly, we need new energy." That was the word they always used when they wanted to get rid of people over 40 without saying it out loud. "My name is Evelyn Thorne. I was 46 years old, and I had spent 21 of those years helping build Summit Solutions from a garage startup into a company worth $60 million. "We will need your answer by 5 o'clock, Preston said. "My father worked factory floors his whole life, and he used to tell me, 'Never let a man in a good suit rush you into a bad decision.' So I did not argue. I opened my leather folder, pulled out a clean sheet of company letterhead, and set their resignation form aside. 'I will write my own,' I said." Preston leaned back and smirked. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." He thought this was over. He thought humiliating me late on a Friday afternoon would make the paperwork feel final by Monday morning. 5 days later, though, I was on a hiking trail at Red Rocks when Nathaniel Brooks, general counsel for the parent company, called me in a panic, stating they needed to resolve a technical misunderstanding. How expensive was that little misunderstanding about to become? Back in my office, I locked the door and stood still for a moment, listening to the muffled quiet on the other side of the glass. I did not touch the framed photo of the Rocky Mountains on my shelf. I did not pack the coffee mug my engineering team had given me 3 Christmases earlier. Instead, I opened the protected file Fiona Gallagher, my attorney, and I had been updating since the acquisition closed. Not because I wanted to fight, but because I knew a storm might come. The letter I wrote was only one sentence. There was no anger, no long speeches, and no mention of 21 years of unpaid nights, missed vacations, and promises the company had long since stopped meaning. It was a conditional resignation. It stated that my resignation would become effective only after full settlement of the compensation, bonuses, equity, and protections already defined in my executive agreement and under Colorado law. To anyone careless, it looked routine, like a standard exit statement. At 4:57, I handed it to Diana Holt in Human Resources. She skimmed the top line, saw the word resignation, and gave me the same tight little nod people use when they want discomfort to end quickly. "We will mail your final check for the 3 weeks, Evelyn," she said, still not looking me in the eye. "Make sure someone reads the rest," I told her. Then I walked out. The glass doors closed behind me with a soft hiss, and for the first time all day, I felt calm. They thought they had put a price on me. What they had really done was sign the invoice. I just did not think they would understand that by Monday morning, Saturday was quiet. That alone told me more than any voicemail could have. If Preston had truly planned my exit, the weekend transition would have been clean. Instead, my phone kept buzzing on the kitchen counter while I pruned my roses and pretended not to hear it. I never answered. Not because I was playing games, but because I had spent the last year warning them that Aegis, the compliance bridge connecting our systems to several government accounts, could not be handed off by simple guesswork and a Friday ambush. There was a strict transition process. There was a sign-off sequence. There was documentation Preston never bothered to read because he thought replacing me was the same thing as replacing an office chair. By Sunday evening, my phone was silent. The silence was heavy and dark. I sat on my porch, watching the stars over the mountains, knowing that the office servers were starting their automated weekly compliance cycles. Without the signed transition protocols, the system would begin flagging the data streams. Aegis was designed to protect public data, and it did not tolerate sudden changes in administrative authority without security verification. Preston Vance believed that a corporate title gave him the power to override encryption keys and government compliance regulations. He was about to learn that the federal government cared very little about his quarterly restructuring plans. I went to bed early, sleeping better than I had in 6 months, knowing that the structure they had taken from me was already beginning to fracture under the weight of their own arrogance. Monday morning arrived, and I did exactly what my conditional resignation letter allowed me to do. I stayed completely off the grid and used my accrued paid time off. I turned off my professional phone, threw some water bottles in my pack, and headed out early to enjoy the mountains. The crisp autumn air was a welcome relief from the stuffy, glass-walled office where I had spent the last 2 decades of my life. I spent the day hiking the steep trails, watching the golden aspen leaves shake in the wind and feeling a strange, quiet sense of freedom. By Tuesday morning, when I finally turned my phone back on, the tone of the messages had changed completely. The first ones on Monday had sounded annoyed and demanding, written by people who still believed they were in control. "Evelyn, call me immediately. We need your system login credentials," one message from Preston Vance read. "Quick question about the server configuration," said another from Julian Mercer. By Wednesday, the annoyance had dissolved into desperate pleading. Aegis handshake failed. Client portal is unstable. We need the transition credentials immediately to prevent a breach of contract flag. At 2 in the afternoon, Nathaniel Brooks called me from Vanguard Enterprises, the parent company. Men like Nathaniel did not make courtesy calls to former staff. They only called when millions of dollars were actively on fire. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, trying very hard to sound calm, professional, and completely detached from the panic I could hear in his shallow breathing. "We seem to have a minor technical misunderstanding involving your departure from Summit Solutions." I kept walking along the red dirt of the trail at Red Rocks, listening to the wind through the pines. "I am afraid I am unavailable, Nathaniel." There was a long pause on the line. Then he spoke, his voice sharper this time. "Evelyn, we need a brief consultation today. The system is locked." I stopped hiking and sat on a warm rock, looking out over the Denver skyline in the distance. "According to the letter your company accepted, my resignation is not effective until my settlement is fully resolved. Since I was locked out of the building and replaced anyway, I have chosen to use my accrued paid time off. Be reasonable, Nathaniel." He cleared his throat. "We need this resolved," I replied calmly. "I am being reasonable. You should read the documents your staff accepted." For the first time, the silence on the other end of the line sounded incredibly expensive. Nathaniel called again the next morning, and this time he did not sound irritated. He sounded careful, measured, and distinctly worried. He asked for a video call. I agreed on one condition. My attorney, Fiona Gallagher, had to be present on the line. When the screen opened, Nathaniel was sitting in a large conference room at the corporate headquarters. Julian Mercer was beside him, stiff-jawed and pale, looking as though he had not slept in days. Nobody looked rushed now. Nobody looked smug. "Evelyn," Nathaniel said, folding his hands on the table.
"We have reviewed your 2018 executive agreement."
I smiled slightly. I assumed someone eventually would. His jaw tightened. "Under the change in control provisions, if your position is eliminated without cause, your equity vests immediately. There are also bonus protections and salary continuation provisions." Fiona spoke before I did, her voice clear and cutting. "And because your client accepted her conditional resignation, then removed her access and duties before satisfying those conditions, you have created a constructive termination problem under Colorado law. The legal doctrine of constructive discharge was clear. Under this doctrine, when an employer unilaterally alters the terms of employment, removes an employee's access, or accepts a resignation subject to conditions that are never met while locking the employee out, the law treats it as an involuntary termination without cause. It was a breach of contract that triggered the full change of control provisions of the 2018 agreement." Julian Mercer muttered something off microphone, looking furious. Nathaniel ignored him. "Your demand totals $1,690,000. I looked directly into the camera. $1,690,000 plus legal fees, And plus the outstanding travel expenses your finance department sat on for 3 months because they claimed Denver hotel receipts threatened your fourth quarter margins. Julian leaned forward, his face reddening. This is extortion. I shook my head. No, Julian, this is what your cost-cutting memo forgot to include. Nobody interrupted me after that. For one long second, all three of them sat there with the same empty expression people get when they finally understand the difference between a cheap decision and an expensive mistake. Then Nathaniel exhaled and asked the question they should have asked weeks ago. What will it take to resolve this by Thursday afternoon? Fiona replied that she would send the formal settlement demand and that the company had until 5 o'clock the next day to sign it, or we would file a breach of contract lawsuit in federal court. While the lawyers were debating the fine print, the company was starting to bleed. Aegis was not some mysterious black box that only I could magically control. It was a highly secure compliance bridge with a documented transition protocol, an internal backup path, and an emergency override process through parent company compliance. But those procedures took time, signatures, and careful planning. 3 things Preston Vance had treated like optional details on Friday afternoon. When the Aegis system detected the unauthorized administrative login attempts on Monday evening, it triggered its protective quarantine protocol. The software was built to comply with federal data security standards, meaning any abrupt change in key personnel credentials without a signed transitional handoff certificate would result in an automated lockout. The system was now completely isolated, and any attempt to bypass the security wall without my cryptographic key would notify the Department of Transportation audit team of a potential data breach. Preston had thought he was simply firing a senior developer, but he had actually tripped a silent digital alarm that was now ringing in the parent company's boardroom. At 11:12, Valerie Cross texted me from a number I still knew by heart. The Department of Transportation portal is unstable. It says the handoff was never completed. Preston is losing his mind in the hallway, shouting at the network administrators. An hour later, another message came in from the team. The technicians are telling him that the security bridger has rejected their override attempts. They are talking about federal contract penalties by the day now, and the clients are beginning to escalate. That was the part people like Preston never understood. Public humiliation inside a conference room stays in a conference room. Operational failure does not. It spreads quickly. Clients feel it. Lawyers smell it. Corporate boards wake up fast when government accounts start failing, especially when the contracts have strict security and uptime clauses. At 4 in the afternoon, Preston finally called me himself. There was no swagger in his voice. There was no polished executive tone, just pure, unadulterated panic. Evelyn, give us the access package now, and we will sort out the money details later. We have a crisis here. I was in my kitchen, making a sandwich and listening to the birds outside. You already sorted the money details out, Preston. You decided 21 years of loyalty was worth 3 weeks of severance. Remember? He raised his voice. This is affecting government accounts, Evelyn. You are putting the company at risk. I took a bite of my sandwich. No, Preston, your decision is affecting government accounts. Aegis went into protection mode because your team skipped the transition steps I documented months ago. I warned you about this in writing 3 times. I sent you the step-by-step transition checklist 6 weeks ago, but you marked it as completed without reading it. He lowered his voice, trying to sound threatening. If this turns into a legal claim, I will tell the board you withheld critical access. I smiled. You can tell them whatever you want, Preston, and I will show them the emails you ignored. He went quiet because he finally understood that the system was not cracking. His story was the rest of Wednesday passed in silence. I worked in my garden, cleaning the flower beds and enjoying the cool autumn air. I knew that at the office, the engineering team was scrambling to find a workaround. However, my engineers were loyal to the technology and to the work we had done together. They knew that trying to force a bypass on Aegis without the proper security keys would trigger an automated security lockdown, which would alert the federal auditors immediately. Preston was trapped between his desire to show the board a quick cost savings and the reality of a secure government contract. By Thursday morning, Vanguard Enterprises stopped pretending this was a minor transition problem. The parent company realized that the local management had committed a massive blunder. Fiona received a call from Nathaniel Brooks, stating that they were prepared to accept the financial terms of the settlement, but they wanted a complete release of all liability and a strict confidentiality agreement. Fiona told him that we would agree to confidentiality regarding the settlement amount, but we would not sign a waiver that prevented us from disclosing the facts of the constructive termination. She explained that we wanted a neutral reference letter and a written statement confirming that my departure was not for cause. Nathaniel said he would have to consult with the chief executive officer. The pressure was building, and the clock was ticking down toward the Friday morning deadline. I knew that every hour the system remained unstable, the potential penalties from the Department of Transportation were growing. The company was losing more money in daily penalties than it would cost to pay my entire settlement. It was a simple mathematical reality that even Julian Mercer could no longer ignore. In addition to those penalties, the legal implications were escalating. Under the federal guidelines, a failure to report compliance issues within 48 hours could trigger a mandatory audit of all their government systems. That meant the entire parent company, not just Summit Solutions, would have their security clearances suspended. If Vanguard Enterprises lost their security clearances, it would wipe out hundreds of millions of dollars in future contract bids. This was no longer about an $11,000 check or a disgruntled executive. It was a threat to their entire corporate existence, and Preston's cheap cost-cutting decision was the match that had started the fire. By Friday morning, Vanguard's parent company stopped pretending. Helena Finch, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Enterprises, flew into Denver before sunrise. She did not call Preston Vance first. She called Fiona Gallagher directly. That told me everything I needed to know about who was in control. When our video conference began at 9 o'clock, Helena looked like a woman running on coffee, corporate fury, and 6 hours of bad news. Preston was not in the room. Nathaniel Brooks was present, along with one board member from Vanguard's audit committee, a quiet man named Charles Abbott. This meant the issue had moved beyond executive embarrassment and directly into material liability. "Mrs. Thorne," Helena said, her eyes fixed on the camera. "I have reviewed the contract file, the transition records, and the communications your counsel sent over. I understand now why this situation is far more expensive than my local executives first believed." I leaned back in my chair. "That is one way to put it, Helena." Her mouth tightened, but she let the comment pass. "We need Aegis stabilized before the markets open on Monday morning. I am prepared to discuss a settlement." I nodded. "Good. Then we will discuss the full contract value of $1,690,000, my legal fees, and the age bias documentation my attorney has prepared. Duplication that your board would rather not see in discovery." Nathaniel Brooks looked down at his folders. Helena did not blink. "The money is not the issue, Miss Thorne. Control is. I will not have a former executive dictate internal leadership changes." That was the first real bluff she tried, testing my resolve. I looked directly at Helena. "Then let me be equally clear, Helena. If Preston Vance remains in power, this company learns nothing. My former team keeps living in fear, and you will be right back in a crisis with the next person he decides to humiliate. I am not signing any agreement that leaves him in a position to destroy what we built." The conference room went completely still. Helena studied me for a long second, then she glanced at the audit director, seeking his silent agreement. Only then did I see it happen on the screen. Not anger, but pure, cold calculation. And when powerful executives stop defending a manager and start calculating their cost, what comes next is inevitable. Helena did not answer me right away. She turned her head, said something to the audit director off camera, and then muted her microphone for 10 long seconds. That was the moment I knew Preston Vance was no longer being defended. He was being assessed as a liability. When she unmuted the microphone, her voice had changed. It was flat and decisive. "I am not removing a sitting chief executive officer because a departing employee demands it," she said, "but I am prepared to place him on immediate non-operational leave pending a formal board review." I looked at Fiona, who gave me a slight nod. And the interim leadership, I asked. Helena leaned forward. That depends on whether there is anyone in the current structure capable of stabilizing operations immediately. I did not hesitate. There is. Valerie Cross. She has 12 years of service. She knows Aegis, the client workflows, and the people your executives have been frightening for the past week. I paused, and before you ask, yes, I know she was on the reduction list that Preston approved. That statement landed heavily. Helena looked off screen again, checking the personnel records on her screen. She just turned 40, did she not? I smiled. Yes, she did, which seems to happen a lot around the people your local executives want to replace. Nobody spoke after that. The silence was absolute. Finally, Helena nodded once. Valerie Cross will be appointed interim director, effective immediately. Preston Vance will be removed from operational authority pending the board review. Your legal fees will be covered in full. We will agree to a full settlement at contract value, with standard mutual non-disparagement and no admission of liability. Fiona spoke up immediately, not without a neutral employment letter and written confirmation that Miss Thorne's departure was not for cause. Helena exhaled slowly. Fine. As soon as the signed agreement is in my inbox, we expect the transition package. I looked at Helena. As soon as the signed agreement hits my inbox, I will authorize the transition. She gave me a long, hard look. You should have been treated better than this, Miss Thorne. And after a week of corporate language, that was the first truly human sentence anyone there had said to me. Fiona and I watched the Zoom screen fade to black. We did not celebrate immediately. We sat in the silence of her office for a few minutes, listening to the distant hum of traffic down on the street. It was a strange feeling to realize that a multi-million-dollar corporation had just capitulated to a single sheet of paper and a clear explanation of the law. Fiona began gathering her notes and putting them into her briefcase. We should have the final documents within 2 hours, she said. They are in too much of a panic to drag us out any further. I stood up and walked to the window, looking at the mountains in the distance. Feeling the weight of the last 21 years finally lifting from my shoulders, the final agreement arrived in my email inbox. At 6:15 that evening, I read every single line twice to make sure there were no hidden clauses or corporate traps. The document was clean. It specified a full contract payout of $1,690,000, complete coverage of my legal fees, a neutral reference letter from Vanguard Enterprises, and a written confirmation that my departure was not for cause. It also included a consultation clause that allowed them to pay me a standard hourly rate for any future transition assistance, which let the parent company save face without letting Preston Vance save his position. I signed the electronic document, Fiona signed, and Helena Finch signed for Vanguard. Only then did I send the transition package through a secure, encrypted file transfer. The complete documentation, the staged administrative credentials, and the step-by-step authorization steps Valerie Cross would need to complete the Aegis handoff properly. I sent them directly to Valerie's personal email, ensuring neither Preston nor Julian Mercer could intercept them and claim credit for the resolution. 9 minutes later, my phone rang. Evelyn, Valerie said, her voice shaking, Aegis is stable. The portal is back online. Helena Finch just called me herself to confirm my appointment. I leaned back in my kitchen chair and closed my eyes. Then breathe, Valerie, and take care of the team, she whispered. They were going to cut me next week, Evelyn. I sighed. I know, but they did not. Now go show them what you can do. There was a long silence between us that said more than any words could. It was a mix of relief, shock, and the quiet realization that the storm had passed. I hung up the phone, set it down on the counter, and let out a long breath. I looked around my quiet kitchen. For 21 years, my life had been dictated by servers, compliance deadlines, and the constant stress of corporate survival. I had missed family dinners, worked through holidays, and poured my heart into building a system that Preston Vance had tried to reduce to an $11,000 check. Now it was done. I went to the cellar, found a dusty bottle of Cabernet that my father had given me years ago, and poured myself a glass. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the last rays of sunlight turn the peaks of the mountains a deep, burning orange. The money was life-changing, and I would not pretend it did not matter. But the real victory was the silence. The corporate noise was gone. replaced by a quiet sense of peace that I had not felt since Summit Solutions was just a three-person startup operating out of a freezing basement. Respect is given freely, and sometimes it arrives as an invoice. 6 months later, I ran into Spencer Cole in a cafe 3 blocks from the old office. He looked like a man who had started saying yes to meetings before he finished swallowing his coffee. He had the same expensive shirt and the same nervous energy, but the arrogance they had handed him on my way out was gone. "Evelyn," he said, stopping at my table, "I heard you retired." I smiled, holding my coffee cup. "Retired is a generous word, Spencer. How is Summit Solutions?" He gave a tired laugh and sat down. "Better, actually. Valerie cleaned house. Preston is out. Julian resigned before the board finished its audit." I raised my eyebrows. "An audit?" Spencer nodded. "They found he had manipulated the third quarter projections to make the restructuring look smarter than it was." Valerie did not just stabilize Aegis. She resolved many underlying issues that others were too frightened to voice. I smiled into my coffee. He looked at his hands. "I owe you an apology, Evelyn. I thought I was being promoted because I was ready. The truth is, I was just cheap. That is not the same thing." I looked at him. "You were not the disease, Spencer. You were just hired by it." He let out a breath and nodded. Before he left, he said one more thing. "For what it is worth, nobody talks about that Friday anymore like you lost. They talk about like that was the day. The company finally learned what experience costs." I watched him walk back toward the office and realized that the story they were telling was finally the right one. I did not retire. I just stopped giving the best hours of my life to people who thought loyalty came cheap. These days, I help other professionals read the fine print before someone else uses it against them. It started with a few quiet calls from former colleagues, then friends of friends, and then people I had never met who had heard some version of what happened at Summit Solutions and wanted to know how to protect themselves. The answer was never glamorous. I tell them to keep records, save emails, and read every contract twice. Don't let anyone rush a signature on a Friday afternoon and call it generosity. Most of all, don't let a frightened executive convince you that your value disappears just because they have decided your salary makes them uncomfortable. In the year after I left, I helped a dozen people negotiate exits they would have accepted for far less if they had stayed scared. My father was right. Power does not always sound loud. Sometimes it sounds calm. Sometimes it sounds like a woman saying, "I will not sign that yet. I am Evelyn Thorne." At 46, I learned that the most dangerous thing a company can do is confuse dignity with weakness. They offered me 3 weeks after 21 years. 5 days later, that disrespect cost them $1,700,000.